The wind moved slowly across the high plains, carrying dust that shimmered under the fading sun. Out there, where the horizon looked endless and the silence weighed heavier than iron, stood a ranch that people whispered about when they gathered in town. They said it was the richest spread for miles, the kind of land where cattle roamed free and barns overflowed with grain. But behind the fences of polished wood and the tall, proud house of stone and timber, there was no joy, only echoes of what had once been. The man who owned that land was known simply as Elias Grant, though most folks in town called him the rich cowboy. He had the look of someone who carried his grief like a badge on his chest, broad-shouldered, stern-eyed, his jaw cut sharp as a blade. There had been a time when Elias smiled, when laughter shook his house and music drifted through its windows. But that time died with his wife. She had been his heart, his gentleness, his tether to a world of softness. When fever swept her away 2 winters ago, Elias buried more than his companion. He buried the better half of himself. And though the land remained vast and the barns remained full, the house felt hollow, the walls whispering with absence. Left in his care were 2 boys, Samuel, barely 10, and Jacob, no more than 6. They carried their grief differently. Samuel grew quiet, his eyes dark with things he didn't know how to say. Jacob, too young to understand the permanence of death, asked questions that stabbed like knives. "When is Mama coming back?" Elias never answered. He couldn't, so the ranch became a place of silence. Meals were taken without words. The night stretched long, filled with the sound of a rocking chair creaking under a lonely man's weight. And the boys, without the warmth of a mother, drifted like little ships in a storm, untethered and lost. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, another life unfolded in shadows. Her name was Clara Hayes, a young teacher who had come west with nothing but a suitcase full of worn dresses and a small trunk of books. She was the daughter of a preacher, raised on sermons and sacrifice, and for most of her years she had lived with very little. When her father died, the world gave her no mercy, no inheritance, no family to turn to, only the faint hope that somewhere, out in the frontier, she might find a place where her skills mattered. But the West was not kind to women who walked alone. The little money she carried vanished quickly, spent on food and the cheapest room she could find. And when the schoolhouse closed after the town council declared there was no funding to pay her, Clara was left stranded, a teacher with no classroom, a woman with no home. She packed her books again and carried them like a treasure chest, wandering dusty streets and staring at porches where lamps glowed warmly in the night. She had nowhere to go, no kin to ask for help. Pride kept her from begging, desperation kept her moving, and so it was. On a pale evening when the sky burned with streaks of crimson and gold, that her path crossed Elias Grant's. He was riding home from the south pasture, the brim of his hat low against the glare. His horse moved steady, hooves thudding against the dry earth. Up ahead, near the bend of the road where sagebrush grew thick, he saw a figure walking, small, tired, dragging a heavy trunk behind her. At first he thought it might be some drifter, another soul lost to the endless plains. But as he drew closer, the image sharpened. A woman, her dress dusty and frayed, her hair pinned neatly through strands had fallen loose in the wind. She walked with her head held high, even as exhaustion clung to her every step. Elias slowed his horse. He studied her with the caution of a man who trusted no one anymore. She looked poor. Cowboys, most of you watch but still haven't subscribed. We're riding close to 1,000. So saddle up with me, hit that subscribe button, and let's ride this trail together. She looked hungry, and yet there was something unbroken in her posture, something that said she would rather collapse on that road than bow her head to pity. When his shadow fell across her, she stopped. Slowly, she turned her face toward him. Their eyes met for the first time. "You're a long way from town," Elias said, his voice rough from days of silence. She tightened her grip on the trunk handle. "I was heading toward the river. Thought I might find a place there." "River won't give you shelter," he replied, looking at the way her shoes were worn nearly through. "Not this time of year. I'll manage." It wasn't defiance in her tone, more like determination woven with exhaustion. Elias studied her again. Something about the woman unsettled him. She wasn't like the others he'd seen drift into town only to vanish within weeks. There was steel in her, thin but unbending. And though her cheeks were hollow, her eyes held light, clear as morning sky. "Name?" he asked. "Clara Hayes." He nodded slowly. "Elias Grant." Her gaze flickered, recognition sparking. Everyone knew the name. Everyone knew the ranch. She shifted the trunk a little higher, as if the weight of his presence pressed heavier than the wood she dragged. "I've heard of you," she said carefully. "Most have." The silence stretched. His horse snorted, pawing at the dirt. Clara's chest rose and fell, each breath steadier than the last, though he could see her arms trembling from fatigue. Finally, Elias leaned forward in the saddle. "Where are you going with that trunk?" "Anywhere I'm allowed to stay." "Got family out here?" She shook her head. "No family. Just books." Elias let out a breath long and heavy. He could have ridden past her. He almost did. But something, maybe the way her voice didn't beg, maybe the way her shoulders stayed straight despite the dust, made him pause. He dismounted slowly, boots hitting the dirt with a thud. The horse lowered its head, calm under his hand. He stepped toward her, his height casting a taller shadow now. "You won't last long out here without a roof," he said flatly. "I've lasted this far. Not much farther to go before the nights kill you." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. "Then I'll keep walking until I can't." That answer struck him harder than he expected. She wasn't fragile, not in spirit, but she was desperate. He could see the hunger in her cheeks, the weary ache in her bones. And yet she carried herself with a dignity that reminded him of someone he'd lost, of his wife. For a moment, Elias felt the ground shift beneath him. His chest tightened, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years pressing against the walls of his grief. He shut it down quickly, clearing his throat and adjusting the reins. "Come on," he said at last. "I'll take you as far as my place. You can get water. Rest your feet." Clara hesitated. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing like a blade. "And why would you do that?" Elias's stare was unyielding. "Because my boys don't need to see another grave on the roadside." And so, with no other choice, Clara Hayes lifted her trunk and followed the stranger whose name carried both wealth and sorrow. As the sun sank and shadows stretched long, the road ahead led them toward the Grant Ranch, toward a house empty of laughter, toward two lonely boys staring at a fading fire, and toward a proposal that would change all their lives. But none of them knew it yet. They only knew the night was coming, and they had to face it together. The night fell heavy over the plains, as it often did, cloaking the horizon in deep blues and silvers. Stars stretched like scattered embers across the black sky, cold and distant. Elias Grant rode ahead, rein steady in his calloused hands, while Clara Hayes walked beside his horse, dragging her trunk along the dirt road that led toward his land. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the horse's hooves striking the earth and the weary shuffle of Clara's boots. She said little, and he liked it that way. Words in his experience were fragile things, easily spoken, easily broken. Better to keep quiet, but Clara's mind was far from quiet. With each step she took, her thoughts tangled like threads pulled too tight. "What am I doing?" she asked herself. "Walking into the home of a stranger, a man the town calls rich but ruthless, a man with shadows in his eyes, and yet what choice did she have? The truth was simple. There was nowhere else to go." When they reached the ranch, Clara's breath caught. The house rose tall and solemn against the starlit sky. Built from stone and timber, its wide porch lined with pillars like watchmen. It wasn't the house of a poor cowboy. It was the house of a man whose hands owned land, cattle, and influence. But despite its grandeur, it felt empty. No light spilled from the windows. No laughter echoed within. Elias dismounted, tied his horse, and motioned for her to follow. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. The hearth burned low, casting weak light across the room. Two boys sat on the floor near the fire, huddled close, as though afraid of the dark. "Samuel." "Jacob," Elias said, his tone steady but softened. "We have a guest." The boys turned. Their faces mirrored his, sharp eyes, solemn expressions far too old for their years. Samuel, the older, stood quickly, straight-backed like he'd learned to carry responsibility too soon. Jacob clutched a small wooden horse, his knuckles white around it. Clara felt their eyes scanning her, curious but cautious. She lowered herself to one knee so she wouldn't tower over them. "Hello," she said gently. "My name is Clara." Jacob tilted his head. "Are you going to stay?" The question startled her. She forced a smile. "Only for tonight." The boy's mouth curved into the faintest hint of disappointment. Samuel said nothing. Elias showed her a small room at the back of the house. It was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a chair, and a wash basin. Dust clung to the window frame. Clearly, no one had used it in years. "You can sleep here," Elias said. "Tomorrow we'll see about where you're headed." Clara set her trunk down and nodded. She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in her throat. Gratitude often felt like weakness, and she had survived too long by not appearing weak. Instead, she said softly, "I'll earn my keep for the night." "If there's wood to chop or dishes to wash," Elias cut her off with a shake of his head. "Rest. You look like you've walked 100 miles. Maybe she had. Maybe more. Later, she lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling where moonlight painted pale lines. Through the walls, she could hear faint noises, the creak of the rocking chair in the front room, the restless turning of children in their sleep. She thought of the boy's eyes, so full of something she recognized all too well. Loneliness, the kind that eats away at you in silence. Clara pressed her hand against her chest, as if to quiet her own hunger. Not for food, but for belonging. For once in her life, she wanted to be needed. By morning, the house had come alive in its own quiet way. Elias was already outside tending the horses when Clara rose, and the boys were at the table, their small hands folded awkwardly. As if waiting for instruction, she found bread in the pantry, hard, nearly stale, and butter that had begun to sour. She set it before them, and though it wasn't much, the boys ate eagerly. "You're a teacher, ain't you?" Samuel asked, his voice careful. Clara looked at him, surprised. "Yes, I was," he nodded. "Mama used to read to us every night." The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Clara swallowed hard, then opened her trunk and pulled out a book with a frayed spine. She sat at the table, the boys leaning close, their shoulders brushing hers. Her voice filled the room, steady and warm, carrying stories of faraway places, of nights and rivers and stars that listened. For the first time in months, maybe years, the Grant house heard something other than silence. Elias stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. He said nothing, but in his chest something shifted. The sight of his sons leaning against that woman, their faces bright with wonder, was something he hadn't thought possible anymore. And for the first time in a long while, he let himself imagine a future different from the one he had resigned himself to. But the plains are cruel teachers, and the West does not allow softness for long. That evening, Clara walked back toward the small room Elias had given her, the sound of the boys' laughter still ringing faintly in her ears. She touched the trunk of books, the only possessions she had, and felt the sharp sting of truth. Laughter would not keep her warm forever. She needed shelter. She needed permanence, and though she did not know it yet, Elias Grant, watching her silhouette move down the hallway, her presence igniting corners of his home long dark, was already shaping the words of a proposal that would change everything. The days that followed passed like clouds rolling across a restless sky. Clara Hayes stayed at the Grant Ranch longer than she had planned, at first for a night, then 2, then nearly a week. Each morning she rose early, her hands already busy before the sun even broke the horizon. She swept floors, tended to the boys, washed dishes that had long sat in quiet neglect. Elias never asked her to. She simply did. And in return, the house, once hushed like a mausoleum, began to breathe again. The boys clung to her quickly. Jacob, the youngest, followed her like a shadow, tugging at her skirts and peppering her with questions about letters and numbers. Samuel, older and quieter, tested her with the sharp edge of suspicion at first, but when she read from her books in the evenings, even he leaned closer. His serious eyes softening, they began to call her Miss Clara, though Jacob sometimes slipped and called her Mama before quickly correcting himself. Every time it happened, Elias's chest tightened with a pain he could not name. He watched her silently in those moments, leaning against a doorway or sitting heavy in his chair, studying the way she bent down to Jacob's level, the way she brushed Samuel's hair out of his face when he pretended not to care. She didn't force affection. It flowed out of her as naturally as water from a spring. It frightened him, because Elias Grant had lived long enough to know that anything warm and tender was also fragile, destined to be lost. He could not afford to lose again. One evening, when the sky bled orange and violet, Elias stood outside on the porch, staring across the endless fields. He heard her footsteps before she spoke. Clara joined him, her arms folded against the cooling wind. "Your boys are good boys," she said softly. "They are," he replied. "They just need someone to remind them they're still allowed to be children." He glanced at her. There was no judgment in her tone, only truth. "But it still cut deep. You think I don't try?" "I think you try the only way you know how. But they need more than food and a roof. They need—" She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. Elias finished for her. "They need a mother." The words hung between them like a knife suspended by a thread. Clara shifted, her fingers tightening around her arms. "Yes," she whispered at last. That night Elias could not sleep. He sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, the lamplight flickering shadows across his face. His mind wrestled with the thought that had been gnawing at him ever since Clara first stepped through his door. He needed her. Not for himself, at least that's what he told himself, but for the boys. Samuel needed someone to ease the burden he carried too young. Jacob needed someone to answer the questions that broke Elias's heart each time they were spoken, and Clara needed something too. He had seen the way she looked at her worn trunk of books, the way her eyes lingered on the cracks in the ceiling, the way she held her hands close to the fire as if afraid the warmth might vanish. She needed shelter. The answer, as bold and reckless as it seemed, began to harden in his chest. He could give her what she needed, and she could give his sons what they needed. By dawn, the decision was made. The following evening, after supper, Elias waited until the boys were asleep before speaking. Clara was gathering dishes when he said her name. "Clara," she looked up. His voice carried a weight that rooted her in place. "Sit." Confused, she set the plates aside and lowered herself into the chair across from him. The lamp flickered between them, shadows dancing on the walls. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His eyes locked on hers with a kind of determination that made her throat tighten. "You need shelter," he began, his voice low but steady. "My sons need a mother. I'm offering you both." Clara froze. For a heartbeat, she thought she had misheard him. But his expression told her otherwise. Serious, unyielding, a man who spoke only after he had thought long and hard. Her pulse quickened. "You're proposing?" "Yes. Marriage?" "Yes." The word struck her chest like a hammer. She rose from her chair, pacing the room, her hands trembling against her skirts. "You can't mean that. You don't even know me. I know enough," Elias said. "I know you've kept my boys smiling for the first time in years. I know you've filled this house with more life in a week than I've managed since—" He stopped, his jaw tightening, unwilling to say her name aloud. "Since before," Clara turned sharply. "And you think that's reason enough to ask me to be your wife? Because your boys need a mother? Because I need a roof over my head?" "Yes," he said again, unflinching. "It's reason enough," her breath hitched. The bluntness of it left her shaken. This wasn't romance. This wasn't courtship. It was an arrangement, a bargain carved out of desperation. She shook her head, her eyes burning. "You don't want me. You want what I can do for your sons." Elias stood, his shadow stretching tall against the wall. "And you don't want me either. You want shelter. You want safety. That's what this is. Two needs meeting in the middle." The words cut her, because part of her knew they were true. She did need shelter. She did need safety. But marriage built on necessity alone, was that life? Or was it another kind of prison? "I won't be bought," she whispered fiercely. I'm not buying you, Elias said, his voice rough, almost desperate. I'm offering you a place here, a name, a family. Stability you'll never find wandering these plains alone. Clara's hands trembled. She turned her back to him, staring at the flicker of the fire. Inside her chest, two battles raged, pride against survival, fear against longing. The days that followed were filled with silence between them. She did not answer his proposal. She couldn't. But his words lingered, echoing in every corner of the house. At night, when she lay awake in the small room, she thought of Jacob's arms wrapping around her waist when she read him a story, of Samuel's guarded eyes slowly softening when she corrected his writing. She thought of the warmth in their laughter, and how much she already dreaded the thought of leaving them. She thought, too, of the cold nights that waited outside this house. Nights when the wind would tear through her thin dress, when the only roof above her would be a sky indifferent to her survival. Was pride worth more than life? Was freedom worth more than belonging? By the fifth night, Clara knew the truth. Elias Grant's proposal was not the kind a girl dreamed of. But out here, in a land where dreams died in the dust, it might be the only proposal she would ever have. And as much as she wanted to deny it, part of her heart already ached with the thought of leaving those boys behind. The fire in the hearth had almost died when Samuel leaned forward, his hat in his hands, eyes fixed on the poor teacher who sat opposite him. The silence between them was not the silence of strangers, nor of fear. It was the silence of two lives circling closer, pulled by an invisible force neither could deny. Miss Clara, Samuel's voice cracked slightly, roughened not by weakness but by truth. I need a mother for my sons. They've lost more than boys should ever lose, and you? You need shelter, safety, a home. But I'm not asking only out of duty. I am asking because when I see you here, sitting in this house, I feel as though God himself finally remembered me. Clara's lips parted, her hands trembling against her worn dress. Her entire life she had been offered scraps, leftover kindness, fleeting protection, temporary refuge. No man had ever looked at her and spoken not with pity, but with a raw, unpolished yearning for a future. Samuel, her voice was barely above a whisper. You hardly know me. He leaned closer, his eyes burning like the embers in the hearth. Then let me know you. Let me learn the sound of your laughter, the weight of your silence, the way you pray when you think no one's listening. Let me give you the kind of life you've been denied, and let my sons find the mother they need in you. Her chest rose and fell, her heart pounding against the prison of her ribs. For years she had dreamed of shelter, of love, of belonging, but fear still crept in, reminding her of every time the world had pulled the ground from beneath her feet. Before she could answer, small footsteps echoed down the stairs. Thomas, the youngest, rubbed his eyes with tiny fists, clutching his blanket. Papa, I heard voices. Samuel turned, his sternness softening. Go back to bed, son. It's late. But Thomas's gaze drifted to Clara, and in that innocent stare lay all the unspoken questions of a child who had lived too long without a mother's warmth. Clara's heart broke at the sight. She bent down, gently brushing the boy's hair back from his forehead. Your papa is right. You should sleep, darling. Tomorrow will be brighter. Thomas smiled faintly, and for the first time in months, he reached for a hand other than his father's. He took Clara's fingers in his, squeezing them with a trust she had not expected. Samuel saw it, and his decision was sealed like an oath carved in stone. When the boy had gone back upstairs, Samuel stood tall, his voice firm, unwavering. Miss Clara, I am not a man of flowery words, but I am a man who keeps his word. Marry me, and I swear before God and all the land under heaven, you will never be left alone, nor my sons without love. I will protect you with my life. The firelight danced across Clara's face as tears welled in her eyes. The poor teacher who had once believed she had no future now stood on the edge of a promise she had never dared to imagine. Her lips parted, but before her answer could cross them, a violent knock thundered against the door. Samuel's head snapped toward it, his hand reaching instinctively for the rifle mounted above the mantel. The ranch was isolated. No one should have been here at this hour. The knock came again, louder, sharper. And then a voice, gruff, mocking, soaked with venom. "Rich Cowboy, we heard you've been housing strays. Open up, or we'll burn you out like the rest." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Samuel's jaw clenched. He lowered his voice, fierce and urgent. "Stay behind me. Don't say a word." The fire was nearly dead, but in Samuel's chest, a storm raged alive. He had offered a promise of love. But outside that door, shadows were gathering, eager to rip it away. And in that moment, Clara understood. Her answer would not come with gentle words at a fireside. It would come in the face of danger, in the crucible of fear, where only truth survived. The knocks grew into pounding fists, rattling the wooden door of the ranch house. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her heart racing while Samuel stood tall, rifle in hand, his jaw set like granite. The voice outside sneered again, dripping with hatred. "You think your money makes you untouchable, cowboy? You think you can take in beggars and orphans without answering to us? This land doesn't forgive charity," Samuel's voice thundered back, low but unyielding. "This is my home, my land. And I don't answer to men who hide behind the dark." Silence fell for a moment. Then, the scrape of boots in the dirt, the shuffle of more men outside. Clara's stomach twisted. Whoever they were, they hadn't come to talk. Samuel glanced back at her, eyes blazing with the fire of both fury and love. "Clara," he said, his voice steady though danger pressed against every wall, "take the boys upstairs. Stay low. No matter what you hear, don't let them come down." But Clara shook her head, trembling, yet resolute. "I won't leave you to face them alone." Samuel froze, studying her. In her eyes he saw no fear, only courage, raw and fierce. The courage of a woman who had spent her life surviving storms, waiting for a place to belong. The pounding stopped. Then a crash. The window beside the door shattered, shards of glass spilling to the floor. A hand reached through, fumbling for the lock. Samuel's rifle roared. The hand vanished with a scream. Chaos erupted outside. Shouts, curses, threats carried into the night. Clara grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth, her knuckles white. If they broke through, she would not stand as prey. She would stand as a mother already, even before the word had ever been spoken. Moments stretched like hours, but then, hoofbeats. Fast, urgent. The sound of men retreating into the night, their cries fading into the wind. Samuel lowered the rifle slowly, chest heaving. The ranch fell into silence once more. The fire had burned to ashes, but something new had been lit inside these walls. Samuel turned, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion, but his eyes fixed on Clara. "You should have run," he whispered. "And leave you," she answered, tears streaking her cheeks, though her grip on the poker never loosened. "No, Samuel. If I'm to stay, I'll stay through storms, too." For the first time in years, Samuel smiled, not the proud smile of a rich cowboy, but the fragile smile of a man who dared to hope again. He crossed the room, lowering his rifle, and took her trembling hands in his. "Then say yes," he murmured. "Say you'll marry me. Say you'll be their mother. Say you'll be mine." Clara's lips quivered, her breath catching as if the weight of all her years of loneliness had gathered into this single moment. And then, with the softest yet strongest voice she had ever spoken, "Yes, Samuel. Yes." Tears spilled down his face, though his grip on her hands was firm, unshakable. He pulled her close, and for the first time, Clara felt not like a guest nor a burden, but like a woman finally home. From upstairs came the sound of footsteps. 2 small boys rushing down, their eyes wide with fear from the chaos outside. Clara dropped to her knees, opening her arms without hesitation. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait. They ran into her embrace as if they had been waiting their whole lives for this exact moment. And as Samuel looked down at the sight, the poor teacher cradling his sons, her eyes full of tears but her arms strong enough to hold them all, he knew the truth. He hadn't just offered her shelter. She hadn't just offered him love. Together they had built something far greater, a family, and on that wild frontier where storms came without warning and shadows always lurked, that was the rarest treasure of all.